Okay. Stand back a little bit. There you go. That's fine. Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Can y'all hear me in the back? Okay, good. You have the person who doesn't like to speak again at the front. But all I have to do tonight is say, we're glad you're here. There are plenty of cookies in the back if you want to get a cookie before we start. The restrooms are in the back through the big door, and we can all see the exits. Okay. So tonight we have, for the first part of our program is just the 10 or 15 minutes. Barbara Nelson is going to give you a little overview of the Granite Creek Mural project, which is very exciting. They've already put some paint on there. If you've been walking down there, you've seen it. And she's going to give you a little bit of information about that. And then Sharon Arnold, our conservation chair, is going to introduce our speaker tonight. So go, Miss Barbara.
Thank you. Okay, and not spoken into a microphone, so if I end up with a no here, just let me know. So, Joe told you I'm Barbara Nelson. I am with the Granite Creek Trail Mural Project, and I'm really excited because what I'm going to tell you about real quick is that we're creating the longest single continuous mural in the state of Arizona. And it's going to, thank you, and it's going to consist of wildlife, birds, trees, nothing controversial. It's going to be beautiful. The artist has exhibited all over the world, and he has done 7 murals in this area alone. This mural is going to be on what used to look like this wall. Now we have actually sealed the wall and primered it with a sky blue color, and the artist is painting right now. He may still be out there painting. So if you're walking down the trail, you'll see him, you'll see this mural being created before your eyes. One of the really interesting things is that there's another mural just directionally challenged, south of Gurley, and that mural has been there for quite a while and may need a little fixing up, but it has survived in that place for a long time. Our mural is north of Gurley and runs almost all the way to Willis Street. So it's on the retaining wall behind Chase Bank and Rocks Media, and they are allowing us to put this artwork on their wall, and we have donated it to the city of Prescott. And we did that a couple of weeks ago. The city accepted it. We'll have a celebration here when the mural is finished. But the really cool thing about this mural is that we are going to allow the community to decide what birds and other animals are going into the mural for sure. If a bird is sponsored, it will for certain be in the mural. If it's not, it may or may not be in the mural. There's no guarantee. So, and once a bird is sponsored, that becomes that sponsor's bird alone. Nobody else can sponsor it. So it's exclusive. And we are working with Joe and the Audubon Society to make sure that we get an accurate representation. You can see some of the birds that I've done, so the artist doesn't have to do a lot of research. I've done prototypes for him. And so one of the panels will look something like this. It may not look exactly like this, but this will represent 25 feet long and 10 feet high. And that is why I'm so excited. And I thought, as birders, you would be very interested in going on our website at www.trailmurals.org and looking at all of the birds that are available to sponsor. And we would love it if you would do that. So that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them after the speaker, because I don't want to cut into his time here. But I do want to present to Joe this panel, because she has been so helpful. You're for the artist, going to begin right there.
Okay, here comes Sharon. She's going to introduce the speaker.
I'm actually married to a communication professor, and standing up in front of you always terrified me. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Larry Stevens with us today. I had the pleasure of listening to Larry's presentation last fall when President Audubon sent me to the Verde River conference that was updating from 2 years ago. It was the first conference. And what was so impressive about that conference were people like Larry, who have done so much work to help us understand the Verde River and its needs and what its future can be. Larry is the curator of ecology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. He's director of the Springs Stewardship Institute, which is a standalone 501c3. And there are some brochures on the back table that you can pick up and learn more about the Institute. It needs your support, and I hope that you will do that. Also, Larry is a co-author of a book on dragonfly and banthelfly of Grand Canyon region, and those are available for sale at the back table. He has a very impressive background. He received his PhD in zoology from Northern Arizona University. He served as the ecologist of the Grand Canyon National Park. He's well respected in the field of ecology. Dr. Stevens was the editor for Red Lake Books. He served on many ecological councils in Arizona. He conducted research on biogeography, springs ecology, and published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. You can learn more about Springs Institute on their website. And there are volunteer opportunities, maybe we're going to hear about. So welcome, Dr. Larry Stevens.
Thank you, Sharon. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm going to focus on the Verde River Basin, the springs in the Verde River Basin. Not so much on the birds, but just the general ecology of springs. I'll talk about birds as they come up, but really focused on the Verde River Basin. And here you go. Oh, thank you. Let's see if this works. Yeah, there you go. And our Springs Stewardship Institute is a 501c3 up in Flagstaff. We work on springs all around the world. I'll be doing a sabbatical in Italy later this year to work with European colleagues on springs over there. And our mission is pretty simple. It's that we're trying to improve the understanding of springs as ecosystems rather than just as hydrologic features. So as ecosystem, and to improve their stewardship and management. All right, so in this is an example of a seafloor bed spring. You might have heard of these things. They were discovered about 50 years ago by a friend of mine, and these are remarkable isolated features on the floor, on the seafloor, 3, 4, 5 kilometers below the ocean surface, hosting all kinds of unique biodiversity. Very similar to springs on land. Springs are places where groundwater reaches and often flows from the Earth's surface. But for example, seeps are very small springs. These are, in kind of bureaucratic language, they're surface to subsurface, groundwater dependent, bottom up, headwater wetland ecosystems. And just words for any bureaucrat in the audience there, having to do with applications of federal designation. But these are incredibly important features in the landscape, not only biologically and historically, but also culturally. Every pretty much every culture on Earth, perhaps except our own, regards springs as being special places, divine places in many cases. And the good news is that if the aquifer supporting the spring is in good shape, the springs can be relatively easily restored and managed. And that's important because these are places where you can actually make some headway. Well, we have a problem in English. It's called homography. The word spring doesn't show up until about 18 definitions down in Merriam's website. First thing that shows up is a website that advertising a software program called Spring. Of course, the mechanical device shows up, Easter shows up, and all kinds of festivities associated with spring break show up. So we don't really get to the word spring until way down the list. This is a problem because that means we have not been spending as much time on understanding what springs are. We get involved in these other definitions. And springs are, for me as an ecologist and a zoologist, springs are remarkably complicated systems. They might be very small, but this is the array of topics that you might have to explore to understand the dynamics of a single tiny spring. A huge array of ologies here, of which, as we go through life and learn a little bit about some of them, but to be an expert in all of them is, of course, impossible. That makes springs very multidisciplinary subjects for study and analysis. Let's see, going here. Maybe not.
You want me to sign?
Yeah, these are them. Next slide. Thanks. So today I want to talk about the Verde River Basin, its geography, and the springs that are in it. Talk about groundwater in northern Arizona in general, because it's such an important topic for it. As our population's burgeon here, where we get water we'll be looking more into our groundwater supplies. Talk about the distribution and ecology of springs. I'll have spend some time on the birds that are associated with springs, and then look at climate change and how to sustainably use springs. It comes as a surprise, I think, to people to understand how many springs there are in the landscape. This is the Colorado River Basin. And there are about 30,000 springs that have been reported. There were probably 50,000 springs in the landscape that many haven't been reported yet. But this is the Colorado River Basin, 250,000 square miles. The upper Colorado River Basin, with the cutoff being the upper basin states of Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado, is a landscape in which water is being exported from the landscape, and other things too, forest supplies, minerals, and whatnot. Those resources get shunted down into the lower basin and to the other side of the Rockies and over to California. But we've got a springs density of about 0.05 springs per square kilometer. Yes.
There's a recording going on over there.
Okay.
Give me a moment.
Maybe let's shift to the next slide here.
See.
There, it's done.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so Arizona is part of the Colorado River Basin, with about 11,000 springs reported so far. We started when I started looking at Arizona about 10 years ago. There was a list of about 2,000 springs, and we've been able to build that number up quite a bit by doing a fair amount of study. The springs, as you can see in blue, they're not distributed randomly across the landscape. They're distributed places where the landscape is kind of broken up. The edge of the Mogollon Rim, the inside of Grand Canyon, the Sky Islands down in southeastern Arizona, all those landscapes support high densities of springs. Only a few hundred of these springs have actually been looked at as ecosystems. So we're just beginning to learn more about Arizona's springs as ecosystems. But these springs collectively produce about 12,000 liters per second of water for the state. That's about 6 or 7% of the state's annual water budget. Most of that, or much of that water is not actually monitored, and it may be used for ranching or recreation purposes and whatnot, but it's not kept much track of. We don't have a statewide analysis of springs, except for what you see here. So in the Verde River, this 270 kilometer long river system that we're in here right now, it's the second largest river in the second largest river lying entirely in Arizona. sixth largest river in the state overall. It's we've got so far documented about 825 springs in the landscape, and I'm sure that number will increase to close to 1,000 by the time we get more work on it. Only about 18% of those springs have been visited so far. We don't even know really where the headwater springs of the Verde River are. That's unfortunate. It seems to us at these times when we're so desperate for water resources, we don't actually yet know all the major sources of the river. Now, what makes the Verde River Basin so special and such an important place nationally, even internationally, is the fact that the river cuts across the two geologic provinces that occupy Arizona. The Colorado Plateau to the north and the Basin and Range province, which occupies the entire southern half of the state. So these are landscapes that have been active, these are landscapes that have been active for millions of years, and the species associated with them have moved back and forth as climate has changed, and that makes this region what I call a mega ecotone. It's a feature in which the species from Mexico will move north during the interglacial interfaces like we have going on now. And during glacial phases, which have been many in the last couple million years, those species tend to move south. And so the species get mixed up from these two great geologic provinces, and they're resulting in the incredible biodiversity we have in the Verde River. A little bit about groundwater. Groundwater comes from rain and precipitation and snow. And unfortunately, Arizona, the water that comes into Arizona, almost all of it's evaporated off. More than 90% of the incoming water evaporates away, leaving only about 2 or 3% to actually go into the ground. So our groundwater supplies are quite challenged by the aridity of the region and the loss of water to the air, to the atmosphere. So springs in these kind of arid landscapes are very much at risk from both climate change, warming of the climate, and groundwater depletion. Let's see, a funny thing happened to the drop of water when it landed on the top of the San Francisco peaks 13,000 years ago. That drop of water passed down through multiple aquifers. Some of it flows north towards Grand Canyon, some of it and in several different directions actually, and some of it flows south into the Verde River Basin. So that the passage of groundwater dropping through multiple stacked aquifers can take as long as 13,000 years to emerge in springs here in the Verde Valley. So these springs come out, those springs that are high elevation are where the temperatures are cooled. If the flow path is short, they will come out as cool and high quality water for drinking. But as the water drops down through multiple aquifers, multiple aquitard, an aquitard is a blocking layer of sediments. It's not a funny bathing suit that was popular 100 years ago. It's a stratum of rock that actually prevents water from sinking down. When they get fractured, water can still pass through them, so all of these aquifer and aquitard couplets leak. But when water passes down through faults and fractures and travels some distance, it warms because the earth is warm, and it also becomes chemically enriched. So, it's absorbing minerals from the surrounding rocks. So therefore, upper elevation springs are kind of good for drinking. Those at lower elevation sometimes are quite useless for drinking. In the Basin and Range, you may be familiar with this geologic province. It extends all the way into northern Mexico, occupies all of Nevada, western half of Utah, southern half of Arizona, much of New Mexico, and then further south. This is a landscape that's been really dramatically broken up. Geologic dysentery is a phrase that a geologist friend of mine used to use for it, because the landscape is so fractured and broken up. The Earth's crested peak pulled apart, as it is in the African Rift Valley, and that creates deep faults that allow the passage of groundwater and the storage of water in these kind of basins, like we have in Phoenix area, for example, or Tucson. So with this array of springs, these are the green dots there are springs that have been inventoried. The yellow ones have not been visited yet. Some of them are remarkably isolated. So we have springs in the Verde Basin that are remarkably isolated, like that one. Some springs have been recorded, but aren't actually springs. And so we're trying to tease apart all this through our Springs Stewardship Institute and some of the projects we've been working on over time. With H. Springer and a couple of other colleagues, we've been trying to figure out what kinds of springs exist in the landscape. So we actually developed a dichotomous key to the geomorphic types of springs in the landscape. Flowing springs, loaded springs include cave, hill slope, riparian, gushet. We don't have any geysers in the Verde River Basin, but some interesting cases in the southwest of that. And then hanging gardens. Hanging gardens are features that are quite distinctive for the Four Corners area. This is a world hotspot for hanging garden type springs. And we have springs that are coming out in quiet water environments. Helicrenes are wet meadow springs. Nordic people up at higher elevations and say in the Rocky Mountains call these fens, and our Mexican colleagues call them cienagas. It's the same feature, the wet meadow spring that they occur all across elevation. Some very remarkable patterns of vegetation associated with those. We have exposure springs like Devil's Hole, where you're actually just looking at the surface of the groundwater when you look down into some of that kind of spring. Hypocrene springs are places where all you see is wetland vegetation. The soil is actually dry on the surface, but the water is being expressed through vegetation. And then limnicrene and mound-forming springs and fountains are three other kind of low-velocity spring environments. So we have examples of all these all around our landscape here, and with 13 types overall, we have 11 types of springs in the Verde River Basin accounted for so far. This is an example of this picture of Thunder River in Grand Canyon, but I use this picture to illustrate that it's not only the diversity of types of springs, but it's also the microhabitats that exist within the springs that makes them so biologically unique. And you might have 10 or 12 different microhabitats, each with their own suite of species that may or may not interact with each other, but all those are packed into a single spring. This is only a 1/10 of an acre spring type. It's got about 10 different microhabitats, quite a few unique aquatic species, just an incredibly fascinating place to try to get to and try to work at. I'm going to step through the biota that occur at springs here. Well, eventually we'll get to birds. Sorry, I'm not spending as much time on birds as you're usually accustomed to. But what we find when we look at vegetation in springs is that springs are concentrations of many different kinds of species. Upland species, conifers are pretty common around the periphery of upland springs, like this. Sometimes it's mesquite and acacia at slightly lower elevations. Then you have plant species that are kind of widespread, not just at springs, but they're found in other landscapes as well. Then you have species like the helleborine orchid, a pretty widespread species. Here in the Southwest, it's only found at springs. That's the only habitat it occurs at. And then we have examples also of plants like Mural flavaria, a plant that's found just at a few springs on the floor of Grand Canyon, a very, very limited extent of habitat there. So these springs assemblages are kind of mosaics of all kinds of different plants. They're packed into these small habitats in remarkable concentration, sometimes 100 to 500 times higher species richness in a spring than in the surrounding landscape. Life gets really exciting when you get into the invertebrates that live in springs. Some of the life forms are so bizarre and so poorly known. Whole families of some of these critters might not even be worked out taxonomically, not even described yet. Worms especially, oftentimes isopods. So aquatic invertebrates really make up the great concentration of unique life forms that we have at springs. Oddly, rather few endemic plants that are springs dependent, if that makes sense. In contrast, hundreds, perhaps thousands of aquatic invertebrates that are springs dependent. Why that is hasn't been worked out. There's so much more to learn here. But the poster child of all this is probably the genus Pergolopsis. This is a tiny spring snail. We've got five species in the Verde River Basin. A bull Pergolopsis is only 2 or 3 millimeters long. They're very tiny. But we have about 180 species in North America. Almost all of them are found only at 1 or 2 or 3 or a few springs. So they tend to go endemic at springs very readily. There's one in Montezuma Well, for example. found only there. So, but that's a kind of a characteristic pattern of a lot of invertebrate groups. As we learn more, and as we get into the world of environmental DNA, which is you grab a water sample, the DNA of all the species living in that water can be detected. Astounding, advance in technology. Now we end up with so much data that it will take one sample could take you the rest of your life to try to figure it out. You might have 1,000 species of fungi in a single sample, for example. And we haven't even described any of them. The Verde Valley, again, is this hotspot of biodiversity. Oak Creek has the highest concentration of the highest diversity of caddisflies of any stream in the Southwest, perhaps in Western North America. 58 species of caddisflies. These are critters that the adults look like moths, but the larvae either build cases or drag cases around. Some of them are free living, just tremendous diversity there. 58 species just in Oak Creek. Nobody's looked at Sycamore Creek yet. What's going on there? Much more to learn. And we're really just the doors are wide open on the adventure. Just a 2 years ago, a couple of moth researchers found 2 new species of Petrophila moth. This is an aquatic moth, springs dependent aquatic moth in Oak Creek. So again, there's much more to learn here. Beautiful moths. Okay, when it comes to vertebrates, I'm saving birds for last year. We have a couple of very interesting reptiles and amphibians here in the Verde Basin. The narrow-headed garter snake is a population just found in the Verde and a few other streams in the Southwest here. But because Oak Creek and the Verde system itself are spring-fed, the baseflow is spring-fed, these are really springs-dependent species. Salamanders, also in Arizona, are largely spring-dependent. The several species of leopard frogs, almost all of those are. Quite a few of our fish, more than half of our fish species, native fish species, we have 36 species in Arizona. More than half of those are springs-dependent. And then occasionally you'll have things like some of the bulls tend to be springs-dependent. Our bighorn sheep and deer and elk spring dependent. If the spring is the only source of water in the landscape, well, yeah. Obviously, it's not always the case, but these upland species can also play a pretty big role. So I've been looking at birds my whole life. I started here in Prescott 53 years ago, working on the birds of the Verde River with Steve Carruthers and Roy Johnson at Prescott College and the museum in Flagstaff. And took part in that first big inventory of birds of the Verde Valley. It would be so great to get enough support to be able to repeat that study 50 years later. Haven't been able to find that support yet, but we're still looking. So in looking at all the birds in the landscape here, all the birds in North America, the only one that I can tell is actually springs dependent is our southwestern subspecies of the American dipper. And the reason there is because they nest behind waterfalls. They use moss for their nests, and all of the nests that I've seen and populations I've seen in the Southwest so far have been just at springs. So Carl might object to that statement, but I think this is the only springs-dependent bird in North America, and therefore that is kind of odd. But birds are pretty versatile in their life history. But one thing that's really clear is that when you go to springs and start, especially in the spring and fall, this time of year, and in autumn, and see what's coming into the springs, birds, the songbirds are using springs as stopover habitat in incredible numbers. I've had Wilson's warbler, Audubon-The, yellow warbler land on me trying to get to the water and doing water quality samples. Migratory birds are coming in after a long flight. They're desperate for water. They see a patch of green and they come in on it, and it's just astounding. Sometimes I've seen as many as 35 species of birds at a remote spring in less than half an hour. And it's just the attention that birds pay, and whether they can remember where they are or not, I don't know, but their focus on these is pretty amazing. I'd say Cliff Spring on the North Rim in another couple of weeks is probably one of the best birding spots in all of Arizona. It's a very remote spring and all the birds in the landscape come in on it. Okay, Montezuma Well. Anybody not been to Montezuma Well here? You know what the feature is? It's about 120 yards across, about 60 feet deep, warm water, 72-degree water, loaded with calcium carbonate and kind of a kicker of arsenic. Those chemicals are natural because this is a spring where the groundwater flow path again starts on the San Francisco peaks, passes down through all those strata, hits the basement crystalline rock, comes up at Montezuma Well, and it is a chemically very challenging place to exist. Low oxygen levels, no fish. Occasionally a turtle will wander through. It's a type locality for the now extinct Colorado River otter. But still, it's a very challenging landscape for anything to live in. So the species that live in this have to be somehow adapted to living with arsenic. And how do you do that? First, you want to be very small, live your life cycle very quickly, and that gives you the ability to avoid the accumulation of arsenic in your tissues. That is a characteristic of pretty much all the critters that live here. The story with Montezuma Well is there's the rabbit in the ecosystem is an amphipod about as big as your little fingernail, quite abundant. They feed on algae and whatnot. They kind of swim around. The peripheral vegetation here, unfortunately, hosts several predatory insects that feed on the amphipods. So during the day, it's dangerous for the amphipods to be in the vegetation. They swim out to the middle of the pond. They have to sink down where they don't like sunlight too much. They're negatively phototropic. But they can stay there until dusk. At dusk, 4 species of leeches come up from the ooze from 60 feet down, swimming up. Not all leeches are bloodsuckers. Many leeches are free-living predators. And 2 of these leeches are unique to the well. They can detect the clicking legs of the amphipod. The amphipod has, quite a few pairs of legs there to click. And therefore the amphipods, in their own little way, race from the middle of the pool at dusk to the peripheral vegetation and just hang there motionless. Their whole life is driven by escaping from predators. And that's, they have to do everything. In the process of escaping from predators, they have to do everything. Eat, breed, reproduce, and somehow they make it through. So it's a really fascinating ecosystem. Amphipod, 2 species of amphipods are unique to the well. 2 of the 4 species of leeches are entirely endemic. One is a unique genus of leech that occurs in Montezuma Well. The Granite of Montezuma is a water scorpion unique to the well. This is the smallest giant water bug, the smallest giant toe biter on the planet, and lives there as well. And probably quite a few other species. There's a spring snail and some other critters there. Montezuma Well is a spring with the highest concentration of unique species of any point that we know of in North America. At least 8 unique species there. We haven't even yet gotten through all the biodiversity there. But it's got this incredibly high concentration of unique species because of the constancy and the high productivity of the water, but it's got this chemical kicker of having arsenic in it. So kind of a pretty fascinating place to study. Dean Blinn was a lead researcher on that side. So we all love springs. Some springs we're actually loving to death, but we certainly use them. Humans have always used them. Paper in 2014, where 2 geologists reconstructed the paleohydrology of the Olduvai Gorge in Africa, found that all the human remains were associated with springs. Cuthbert and Ashley, 2014, really fascinating study there. They attributed to these early hominin populations retreating to the spring during times of drought. We have to remember that springs are also ambush points in the landscape. Big predators, every spring pretty much that I go to in wildlands has some evidence of a large predator sitting there waiting for the prey to come along. And it could well be that in those days in Africa, humans were being taken at springs by big predators that were in the landscape. So, but humans have always relied on springs. Here in the Southwest, Vance Haynes and others did lots of excavations of paleo springs, finding this ambush function was quite active there. Early Native Americans going back 12,000, 13,000 years ago, were waiting at springs for their prey. Interestingly, no evidence of occupation of the springs by hunting and gathering cultures, really anywhere in the world. Springs are used as ambush points. It isn't until agriculture comes into the cultural milieu that humans begin to settle at springs and use them for agriculture and irrigation. So among the consequences and impacts of humans here is that let's see. Sorry, I stepped back one minute. Can you go back one?
Yeah.
Yes. So anyway, humans have used springs all of our history. We're using them quite actively now, and for many purposes, but particularly as freshwater sources and for livestock. And livestock has quite a large impact on spring all around the world. There are also places where non-native species tend to show up. Oddly, at springs, there's a positive relationship between the number of native species and the number of non-native species. This is not intuitive. You think there are more native species would keep non-natives out, but that's not the case. And that's a subtle reflection of the kinds of disturbances that are going on. Trampling by anything, wildlife as well, can open up space, and our weed species are pretty capable of getting around. We're in many cases loving our springs to death. It's very difficult to find a thermal spring that hasn't been manipulated by humans at this point. So our ability to learn about the ecology of those is pretty limited. This all comes about I think it really comes back to this issue of homography and the word spring being so complicated in the English language that springs haven't gotten much attention. And that means that they haven't gotten much policy built around them. They're not regarded as surface water. They're not regarded as groundwater. They're kind of they fall between the cracks. There's and this has led to a really limited attention to their ecology as ecosystems. There are only a few springs in the world that have been really looked at in a careful way as ecosystems. So, and also we've got a pretty polarized and poorly informed public about springs. And with the Springs Stewardship Institute, our stock phrase is that what's good for springs is good for all things. And pretty much everybody who's managing a spring wants their spring to be in good shape and flowing. That's pretty much a given. But to get to that point with in discussions with some members of the public is quite challenging. It takes a lot of time to get to it. The headwater spring that provides perennial flow to the Verde River system is Del Rio Spring up near Falls in there. And as you can see, it's a pipe system. It flows down. It has fed some cottonwoods that supported nesting bald eagles. There's a water eagle that lives here that's probably unique. But this is the headwater most spring for perennial flow for the Verde River system, even though the drainage itself heads on the west side of the centrifugal heat. So in looking at kind of the long-term story of flow and how springs are responding over time, it's a little daunting. We're definitely pumping the groundwater down and losing these remarkable ecosystems, and that is also reflected in the chemistry. This is base flow here of the Verde different locations, but they all show the same pattern of groundwater depletion and climate change leading to lower flow. The chemistry varies whether in the northern part of the northern part of the basin or the southern part. In terms of this is the water temperature. The warmer temperatures in the southern portion of the Verde River Basin, slightly cooler, but all being affected by elevation. As we go up in elevation, water temperature cools, but the pattern is steeper for those streams that are in the lower portion of the basin. Conductance is the amount of mineral content in the water, shows the same pattern there. pH shows the same pattern as well. So the water chemistry varies across the Verde River Basin based on the contributing areas that are the headwater springs. So with that, we try to bring this kind of attention to springs through the Springs Stewardship Institute, and please feel free to take a look at our website. It goes into more detail than this. We're working right now with Friends of the Verde River on a pretty good program to bring education and attention to springs throughout the basin. And the way to do this, of course, is to get the youth involved and get them to understand how cool these things are. I think that every child is an entomologist until about the age of 5 or 6, as far as I can tell. It's so easy to get them involved in turning over rocks and looking for funny little beetles and ew, what's that? And learning about some of these strange critters that live in the water. That's a pretty easy sell there. And it's been really fun to work with the school kids in the Verde River Basin. We do have programs going on elsewhere in the basin to talk about looking at forest restoration. But just to kind of bring home these points, that springs are these remarkable point sources of biological and cultural diversity. For me, I regard them as being kind of the canary's canary in terms of environmental indicators. If your springs are healthy, your aquifer is healthy, the landscape is in much better shape. They have very complex internal and external ecological processes, and springs affect the adjacent landscape. We call them keystone ecosystems because there's a little patch of habitat that can really support a lot of life around it. Sometimes birds will travel 10 kilometers to come into springs. So the impact of the spring on the landscape is pretty tremendous. If the aquifer is in pretty good condition, the springs can be pretty readily restored, and that's really good news. But we still are at a very early stage of understanding these features as ecosystems. We have a lot of information on hydrology, incredible groundwater modeling that goes on, all black box mathematics, but understanding them as ecosystems is a whole new adventure. And education is quite important for being able to preserve the sea fauna. We have to protecting the in-current water quality. We have springs systems and aquifers here in northern Arizona where deep fracture systems are carrying the water straight down 3,000 feet. And when we have a rain event that passes through, say, a whole series of parking lots and sewage plants and whatnot, and that sends that water down into the bowels of the earth, those karstic terrains are really can be polluted pretty easily. So we have a few opportunities coming up. The Nature Festival is going on over in Camp Verde area this week and weekend. On the 8th of May, we're going to do a half-day workshop on springs ecosystem ecology and inventory. That'll take place at the Camp Verde Library, and then we're going to go over to Montezuma Well. Anybody's welcome to sign up for that wants to on the website. We'll do a much more in-depth workshop 23rd to the 25th of May, where if you really want to get into springs and learn how to actually measure things and record your observation about springs. We have a 3-day workshop on that. And we have lots of volunteer opportunities with this project with Friends of the Verde River, which is funded by the Pulliam Trust. In that we'll be going to about 16 headwater springs in the Verde. Some of those are longer walks than others. We can tell you about the difficulty of getting to some of them. Some of them might take ropes, for example, but many of them you can just drive up to. So if you're interested in volunteering on any of those, we're more than happy to let you have you come with us. And then I'm doing a monthly seminar series on springs and spring ecosystem ecology. That's again, you can sign up for that on the website. It's the last Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. So those are pretty fun lectures to give, and please feel free to check those out if you want. All right. I hope I didn't overwhelm you too much, but it's a big world out there, and there's a lot of really wonderful studies still to be done. So happy to. Happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah.
You talk about restoring the spring. Volunteers coming up and say more free. What exactly do you do when people go off, volunteers go off to restore a spring?
Really good question. Totally depends on what has gone on with the spring. And in many cases, if it's a simple kind of too much livestock action at a spring, fencing the source is a pretty straightforward thing to do. with all restoration kind of activities, you can't just do it and walk away. Because if you fence the source of a small spring, the vegetation can grow up and take up the surface water. So thinking about the disturbance regime you want that spring to be subject to, occasionally you might want to open it up to cattle or livestock, for example. But so those kind of discussions go on with the restoration planning. Sometimes springs are up on hill slopes, for example, and people are extracting water from the source, of course. But they haven't built a trail up there, so the hill slope might be eroding pretty actively. That's a pretty common thing we find out in many springs. In some cases, the geomorphology, I could go into a long story about restoration of Hakun Spring up in northwestern Arizona, one of the biggest spring complexes on the Arizona Strip. The landowner had excavated all the spring sources, 10 sources, and so in our planning on it, we're going to cover the landscape over and let the water find its way, and then recreate these wet meadows and stream systems that used to exist there. But the landowner let an alligator go. And so we spent 3 trips up there with an alligator wrestler trying to get this 9-foot alligator, who was meaner than a snake. Finally cornered him, and we're able to get him down and take him to the Phoenix Herpetological Gardens. And we're Clem is still living there. He put on another couple hundred pounds. Eating fruits and bullfrogs, it doesn't make you a happy animal. Anyway, after getting that critter out of there, we were able to come in, recontour the landscape, and let water find its way through the landscape. And we created an 80-acre riparian habitat there that is now pretty much a jewel. That was with the BLM and Park Service. Yeah. So all kinds of things can happen in terms of restoration, but whatever.
I think one of the first maps you put up, and we're in central Arizona Highlands or Mogollon Highlands, depending on what organization you're with.
Yeah.
It looked like the central Arizona Highlands was blue, a lot blue, so a lot of springs there. Was that colorblind or that?
No, that's true. So springs tend to show up in kind of topographically diverse landscapes. The reason for that is the aquifers that are supporting that have water, if they're tilted in the right direction, will pass water, and those are springs. So in broken landscapes like Grand Canyon, like the Mogollon Rim, the Sky Islands in southeastern Arizona, those are places where you really see just tremendous densities of springs.
That's a lot.
Yeah, amazing densities. We never would have guessed about the distribution of these things until we really started mapping them out.
And I just went on your website, but I couldn't find it. Is there a way to sign up where you just send us emails now and then, or just?
Oh, sure, yeah.
It is, okay, I'm looking for it. Okay. Yeah.
This is I'm not sure how to ask this question. Del Rio Springs is the topic.
Yeah.
And I keep seeing the edges of articles about Verde Headwaters State Park in Del Rio Spring. Do you have any background on that?
I don't know enough about that. I know there is an effort afoot to have the upper portion of the Verde designated as wild and scenic. And that's been a big battle, big conservation battle for a while. But it's coming to a head now. So, but as a state park, I haven't heard about that. Del Rio is owned by the city of Prescott. Yeah, partly, and Prescott rents the land out to a grazing operation. So it's pretty hard hit by livestock.
Yes, and I'm wondering about restoration at some point.
Yeah, in some restoration settings, especially if there are endangered species involved, I've seen this in a few places. The spring might go dry, and so the restoration option is to sink a well and supply water to the place where the spring was. When the spring goes dry, within a very short period of time, the unique aquatic life forms will disappear. But if you get there soon enough, of course, you can kind of prevent the extinction of those species.
There may be somebody. Is there anyone in the room that knows a little bit about this state park? All right, I know just a small piece. There is a group of people that are working toward getting the Del Rio Springs area, the Peavine Trail extension, and it's about 700, 800 acres up to, Stillman Lake, not Stillman, Sullivan Lake. Our state legislature and our representatives and senators from this area have, are supporting the request for money. They put in a request for $10 million. And I think it's right now they're talking about 7 million. It hasn't gone all the way through the legislature yet. I think the Courier has done a story or two on it. So I think you could go to the Courier website. But the city of Chino Valley is quite excited about this because they're looking for a recreation magnet. And so they see the extension of the Peatline Trail as one of those things. But that property besides having the Del Rio Springs Ranch has the old Fred Harvey buildings. And that was where the company trained and had a breeding facility for the donkeys and the mules and would carry people down. And also grew quite a few crops. If you're driving on 89, you can see where they used to have the irrigation that came into those fields. And right now there is some grading up there. So it's in the works. Might happen.
That's all you know.
Thanks.
You mentioned that restoration project, they were pumping water to restore the spring. Is part of the definition of a spring that it's perennial, or is there such a thing as a ephemeral spring?
So if you've been to Pike Spring National Monument up on the Arizona Strip, their spring went dry in year 2000, drought year. And for the first time ever, there's a lot of groundwater pumping upslope on that system. And so the Park Service dug a well, and now there's water flowing at Pike Spring National Monument. It was a water source for a Mormon dairy farm. And so they recreated the water. Oddly, there's an amphipod that lives in the spring, and it apparently went into the groundwater and then came back out again because the amphipod is still there. So, you know, always surprises with these things, but what lives under, under the ground, we have life at least a couple kilometers down in some of these aquifers.
Monism as well, where there's so much arsenic in the water. There are those ancient irrigation canals. I mean, how do they use the arsenic for irrigation?
The question is about arsenic and the irrigation systems. All the middens there are loaded with arsenic. Native Americans were eating a lot of arsenic, and who knows whether they could tell that they weren't living as long as perhaps other populations. Yeah. Yeah, the whole landscape is pretty enriched with arsenic, and the only way you can kind of the water scorpion I showed you the picture of, sometime in the last X number of years, we haven't done genetic clock on this yet, but a gravid female water scorpion from the surrounding landscape plunged in the Montezuma well, and at least 2 of her offspring survived. One time in possibly 100,000 years. This is a very, the Montezuma well is a very ancient feature, and water scorpions are flying across the landscape. They aren't scorpions; they're kind of insect. They fly across the landscape every year. I'm sure many plunge into the well. One time, one who's been able to survive that, and 2 of our offspring survived, and they're quite a bit smaller than the regionally common water scorpion. And that is kind of, again, an indicator that you have to live your life fast if you're living with a lot of toxin. So, probably. All right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight, and keep learning.
Yes, that with the rings.
Yeah.